I swore I'd never fall for a rich man after what my father did. Then I spilled coffee on a stranger's $5,000 suit. He offered me a job the next day, and 3 months later, a marriage contract. What I never expected, actually falling in love with him. If you've ever made a promise you thought was unbreakable, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey of how I broke mine in the most unexpected way. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to choose between your principles and your heart. I never thought I'd be telling this story, the one where I broke the most important promise I ever made to myself. But here I am. Growing up, I watched my mum build a life for us with her bare hands. She worked 2 jobs, made our clothes, and somehow still managed to be there for every school play. All while my father lived in his mansion on the hill with his new wife, his former secretary. The same secretary he told my mom not to worry about for 3 years. I was 13 when he left, old enough to understand the betrayal, young enough for it to shape everything I became. I remember standing in our kitchen the night after he walked out, watching my mum cry over bills he'd hidden from her. That's the night I made my promise. I swore I would never depend on a man with money, never trust their smiles or their gifts or their sweet words. I'd make my own way, build my own life, and never give anyone the power to destroy it. Fast forward 10 years, and I was keeping that promise. 3 jobs, barista in the mornings, office admin by day, and online tutoring at night. Every spare dollar went to helping Mum with her medical bills, or into my savings. I shared a tiny apartment with 2 roommates and counted every penny. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had control. I had independence. And most importantly, I wasn't waiting for some rich prince to rescue me. My friends thought I was too harsh, too closed off. "Not every wealthy guy is your dad, Emma," they'd say, but they hadn't seen the look in my mother's eyes when she realized 20 years of marriage meant nothing compared to a younger body and the excitement of something new. They hadn't felt the shame of watching your father show up in his luxury car to take you to dinner while your mum ate leftover pasta alone. I didn't hate rich men, I just knew better than to trust them, and I was doing fine with that philosophy, until that Tuesday morning at Brood Awakening. I was running late for my office job, juggling 3 drink carriers for my boss and co-workers, an unspoken requirement if I wanted to keep my position. The cafe was packed, and I was trying to squeeze through the crowd when someone stepped backward without looking. Coffee went everywhere, all over my white blouse, and all over his suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "I'm so sorry," I gasped, mortified as I grabbed napkins from the counter. That's when I really saw him. Tall, with dark eyes that somehow looked both serious and amused at the same time. His watch alone could have paid off my student loans. "It's only coffee," he said, taking a napkin and dabbing at his ruined jacket. No yelling, no demanding I pay for dry cleaning. Though I think you got the worst of it. I expected condescension. I expected annoyance. What I didn't expect was for him to smile, a real smile that reached his eyes, and hand me his business card. "James Calloway," he said, "and you look like you could use a better job than whatever has you carrying coffee for an army at 7 a.m. I should have thrown that card away. I should have remembered my promise. Instead, I put it in my pocket, where it burned like a secret all day long. I had no idea that simple piece of paper would change everything. I told myself I wouldn't call. I really did. That business card sat on my dresser for 3 days while I scrubbed coffee stains out of my blouse and worked double shifts to make up for being late that morning. But when my landlord slipped a rent increase notice under my door and my mum called about another medical bill, something in me broke. Pride doesn't pay the bills. So I called. I expected to reach a secretary, to leave a message that would never be returned. Instead, James Calloway himself answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call, coffee girl," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Before I knew it, I was scheduled for an interview the next morning at Calloway Enterprises. The building was all glass and steel, reaching so high into the sky, I had to crane my neck to see the top. Inside was worse. Everything screamed money. I almost turned around and left. This was his world, not mine. But I thought of my mom, of those bills, and forced myself to step into the elevator. James's office took up half the top floor. When his assistant led me in, he was standing at the window, looking out over the city like he owned it, which, as I would later learn, he practically did. He turned and smiled, and something fluttered in my stomach that I immediately squashed down. "Emma Carter," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Thank you for coming." The interview wasn't what I expected. He didn't ask about my qualifications or experience. Instead, he asked about my goals, my thoughts on business ethics, even my opinion on his company's latest project. I found myself answering honestly, challenging some of his ideas, forgetting for a moment who he was, and he listened, really listened, like my words mattered. "I need an executive assistant who thinks for herself," he said finally. "Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong." He named a salary that made me blink twice to be sure I'd heard correctly. "Can you start Monday?" Every instinct screamed that this was a mistake. Men like James didn't just offer jobs to women who spilled coffee on them. There had to be a catch. But I needed that money, and something about the directness in his gaze made me nod. The first weeks were a blur. James worked harder than anyone I'd ever met. He was in before me, out after me, always moving, always thinking. I scrambled to keep up, organizing his chaos, anticipating his needs, learning the rhythm of his company. It was exhausting and exhilarating all at once. His inner circle wasn't so easily won over. His CFO, Martin, watched me with suspicious eyes. "James has a soft spot for strays," he told me once, not bothering to hide his disdain. His friends from the social circuit were worse, all expensive watches and hollow laughs, looking through me like I was invisible. Only James's sister, Elise, showed me any kindness, pulling me aside at a company event to whisper, "Don't let them scare you off. He needs someone real in his life." Real, as if anything about this world was real. I kept my walls up, did my job, and reminded myself daily that this was temporary. Just a stepping stone to something else. I refused to be impressed by the private jets, the penthouse meetings, the casual way millions were discussed over lunch. But then came Tokyo. James needed to close a deal that was falling apart, and suddenly, I was on his private jet, watching the world shrink beneath us. "I need you there," he'd said, not explaining why, and I'd been too shocked to argue. For 3 days, I watched him navigate cultural differences and tough negotiations with a patience and wisdom I hadn't expected. He wasn't the shark I'd assumed all wealthy businessmen to be. He listened more than he spoke, compromised where he could, and stood firm where it mattered. On our last night, after the contracts were signed, he took me to a tiny restaurant hidden down an alley. No reservation, no VIP treatment, just incredible food served by an old man who greeted James like a friend. "I come here every time," James explained, watching me savor a bite of something I couldn't name but tasted like heaven. Some things are worth more than luxury. As he spoke about his dreams for his company, the good he hoped to do, I felt something inside me shift. I'd been so determined to see him as my father, selfish, shallow, cruel, that I'd missed who he actually was. Driven, yes. Privileged, absolutely. But there was a depth to him, an integrity I hadn't wanted to see. Why me? I finally asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. Why offer a job to someone who ruined your suit? He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes serious in the dim light. Because when I told you it was just coffee, you looked at me like I'd done something extraordinary by not being angry, like you expected the worst, and that made me wonder what kind of people you'd known before me. I looked down at my plate, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. Because he was right, and that terrified me more than anything. 6 months into working for James, I knew something was wrong. Board meetings ran longer than usual. Hushed conversation stopped when I entered rooms. James was taking calls behind closed doors, something he never did. When I finally cornered him after a particularly tense meeting, he looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. "Just business, Emma," he said, rubbing his temples. But I knew better. I'd become fluent in the language of his expressions, the subtle shifts that told the real story behind his composed exterior. The truth came out on a rainy Tuesday evening. Everyone had gone home, but I stayed to finish preparing for his presentation the next day. I found him standing at his window, silhouette stark against the city lights, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. "My grandfather built this company from nothing," he said without turning around. "My father expanded it, and now the board thinks I'm going to lose it." He finally looked at me, his eyes shadowed. "Unless I get married." I almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his expression remained serious and my stomach dropped. "Married? Why would marriage save your company?" The explanation was like something from another century. The largest investor in Callaway Enterprises was James's great-uncle, a conservative traditionalist who was threatening to pull his support unless James settled down and showed stability. 3 failed engagements in James's past had convinced the old man that his grandnephew was reckless, untrustworthy with the family legacy. "He's giving me 3 months," James said, finally taking a sip of his whiskey. "Get married or lose controlling interest." I felt a strange mix of sympathy and vindication. This was exactly the kind of shallow, image-obsessed nonsense I'd expected from wealthy families. "So find someone," I said. "There must be dozens of women in your social circle who'd jump at the chance." He set down his glass with a sharp click. "Someone who wants my name, my money, but not me. No thank you. I've been down that road." The bitterness in his voice surprised me. This was a glimpse of a wound I hadn't known he carried. Before I could respond, he turned to face me fully, his expression suddenly clearing like he'd made a decision. "Emma, what if it was you?" My mind went completely blank. "What?" "Marry me," he said as casually as if he were asking me to schedule a meeting. "A business arrangement, 1 year minimum, with the option to dissolve the marriage after that if we choose." I waited for the punchline, but it never came. He was serious. "You're insane," I finally managed. We don't. This isn't a movie, James." "Think about it logically," he continued, moving closer. "We work well together. We respect each other. Neither of us has romantic entanglements at the moment. You need financial security for your mother's medical treatments. I need a wife who won't try to take half my company in the divorce." My head was spinning. "So I'd be, what? A paid actress? Pretending to be in love with you?" "No pretending necessary. A marriage of convenience, clear boundaries, mutual benefits." He reached for a folder on his desk and handed it to me. "I've outlined everything. Take it home, read it over. We'll negotiate any terms you want to add." Inside was a contract, an actual legal contract, spelling out the details of our potential marriage, separate bedrooms, joint appearances at necessary events, a generous monthly allowance for me, full medical coverage for my mother, and a final settlement that made my eyes widen, enough money to pay off my student loans, buy a house, and never worry about bills again. I felt sick, angry, tempted, terrified. Every emotion possible crashed through me as I stared at those pages. "This is exactly why I swore I'd never get involved with someone like you," I whispered. "Everything is a transaction, even marriage." Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Think about it," he said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." I took the contract and left without another word. That night, I called my mum. I didn't tell her about James's proposition, just asked how she was feeling. She tried to sound upbeat, but I could hear the pain in her voice, the fatigue. Her treatments were draining her in every way possible, and insurance only covered so much. For 3 days, I avoided James as much as possible, passing necessary information through emails and his other assistants. For 3 nights, I stared at that contract, thinking about my promise to myself, about my mother, about the strange, complicated man who'd offered me a business deal disguised as marriage. On the fourth day, I walked into his office and closed the door behind me. "I have conditions," I said, placing the contract on his desk with my own additions paper-clipped to it. 3 of them. First, I keep my job. Not as your wife, but as your executive assistant. I've worked too hard to be reduced to arm candy. He nodded slowly, studying my face. Second, we're equal partners in this. If I'm at your side in public, then I'm at your side in the boardroom too. I want to learn the business, not just smile for photographers. Another nod, this one with a hint of approval. Third, and here my voice nearly faltered, we're honest with each other, always, no matter what. The moment one of us lies, the deal is off. For a long moment, he just looked at me. Then he extended his hand. Deal. 2 weeks later, in the judge's chambers at City Hall, I became Mrs. Emma Calloway. My mother cried happy tears, believing against all my denials that I'd fallen in love. James's sister Elise watched with knowing eyes, but said nothing beyond congratulations. The great uncle seemed satisfied, if suspicious of the rushed timeline. As James slid a simple gold band onto my finger, I felt a strange sense of vertigo. This wasn't how my life was supposed to go. This was breaking every promise I'd ever made to myself. Yet as James's warm hand held mine, as he looked into my eyes and said, "I do," with perfect conviction, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, or somehow, against all odds, stumbled into something real. I expected living with James to be awkward. What I didn't expect was how seamlessly our lives would blend together. His penthouse was ridiculously large, enough space that we could have gone days without seeing each other if we wanted to, but somehow we kept gravitating to the same rooms, the same spaces. The first surprise came on my 3rd morning there. I woke early, still adjusting to the floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the sunrise. I tiptoed to the kitchen, not wanting to wake him, only to find James already there, hair rumpled, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, making pancakes of all things. "I hope you like blueberries," he said, sliding a plate toward me like this was completely normal. Like we weren't 2 strangers playing house for the sake of a business deal. "I didn't know billionaires could cook," I replied, cautiously taking a bite. They were delicious. He laughed, a genuine sound I was still getting used to. My mum insisted all her children learn, said being rich was no excuse for being helpless. Something softened in his eyes. "She would have liked you." It was the first personal detail he'd shared that wasn't in a company bio or press release. I realized how little I actually knew about the man I'd married. Over the next few weeks, I began to see the James that existed behind closed doors. He worked just as hard at home as he did at the office, but there were other sides to him I'd never glimpsed before. He read voraciously, not just business journals, but philosophy, history, even poetry. He played the piano when he thought I wasn't listening, haunting melodies that made me pause in hallways to hear more. He had a sarcastic sense of humor that only emerged when he was truly comfortable. And he was thoughtful in ways that caught me off guard. He noticed when I was tired and would make me tea without asking. He remembered offhand comments I made, like my favorite flower being daisies, not roses, and quietly adjusted his standing order with the florist. Nothing showy or designed to impress, just small kindnesses that were harder to dismiss than grand gestures. We settled into routines, coffee together in the mornings before work, takeout and case files in the evenings. Sometimes we'd work in silence for hours, and it never felt strained. We became partners in more ways than just on paper. I helped him navigate the politics of his family's company, and he taught me about finance and strategy in return. But I still kept my guard up. I still reminded myself this was temporary. I still kept my own apartment, even though I rarely went there. Just in case. Then my mum's health took a sudden turn. The call came during a board meeting. Her doctor, saying she'd collapsed and been rushed to the hospital. I slipped out of the room, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. When I turned around, James was right behind me. "What do you need?" he asked. No hesitation, no questions. "I have to go to her," I managed, already calculating how long it would take to get to the airport, book a flight, get to her town 3 states away. "The company jet is already being fueled," he said, taking my elbow and guiding me toward the elevator. "I've had your assistant clear your schedule for the week. We can be there in 2 hours." "We?" I echoed, stunned. "Unless you'd rather go alone," he said, suddenly uncertain. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look vulnerable. I should have said yes. I should have maintained that boundary. Instead, I heard myself whisper, "Please come." The next 5 days became a blur of hospital corridors, doctor consultations, and terrifying moments when it seemed like we might lose her. Through all of it, James was my anchor. He asked the right questions when I was too emotional to think clearly. He charmed the hospital staff into giving my mother the best care. He held my hand during the worst moments and never once made me feel weak for breaking down. When I finally fell asleep from exhaustion in the uncomfortable hospital chair, I woke to find he'd somehow arranged for a recliner to be brought in and had covered me with his jacket. He was on the phone in the hallway, quietly handling a business crisis I'd completely forgotten about, handling it so I wouldn't have to. On the 3rd night, when my mother was finally stable, he disappeared for several hours. I was too tired to wonder where he'd gone until he returned with a small army of specialists from a renowned medical center. "Second opinions," he said simply, like flying in doctors from across the country was nothing. "Why are you doing all this?" I asked him later, when we were alone in the quiet hospital room, my mother finally sleeping peacefully, with a better diagnosis and treatment plan than the local doctors had offered. He looked surprised by the question. "Because she's your mother, because you care about her." He paused, then added more softly, "Because you matter to me, Emma." Something cracked inside me then, some wall I'd been carefully maintaining. Because I believed him. Because in that sterile hospital room, with no audience to impress and nothing to gain, I could see the truth in his eyes. This wasn't about the contract or appearances or obligation. This was just James, being the man he actually was when all the trappings of wealth and power were stripped away. We flew home a week later, my mother stable, and with a private nurse James had insisted on hiring. In the quiet of the plane, as he worked and occasionally glanced over to check on me, I faced an uncomfortable truth. The lines were blurring. The neat compartments I'd created to keep my heart safe were dissolving. I was supposed to be playing a role, the convenient wife, the business partner. I wasn't supposed to feel this warm rush when he smiled at me across a room. I wasn't supposed to miss him when he traveled for business. I wasn't supposed to wonder what it would be like if this marriage were real. Back home, our routine resumed, but something had shifted. The careful distance we'd maintained began to close. Our conversations stretched later into the night. Our hands would brush when passing files, lingering just a moment too long. I found myself watching him when he wasn't looking, studying the curve of his jaw, the concentration in his eyes as he worked. One night, I found him in his study, staring at an old photograph. When I moved closer, I saw it was a family picture, a younger James with his parents and sister at what looked like a lake house. "My father wasn't like yours," he said quietly, not looking up. "He loved my mother until the day he died. They were partners in everything." He finally met my eyes. "I always wanted that. Not the business marriages my great-uncle values. Something real." I swallowed hard. "Then why agree to this?" I gestured between us. "Because I had to save the company," he said. Then, more softly, "And because from the moment you stood up to me in that interview, I knew you were different. I thought, maybe with time." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between us, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I should have reminded him of our agreement, of the boundaries we'd set. I should have retreated to my room and locked the door. Instead, I sat beside him on the sofa and let him show me more family photos, let him tell me stories about his childhood, let myself see the lonely boy who had grown into this complicated man. When his hand found mine, in the dim light of the study, I didn't pull away. And that's when I knew I was in trouble. Because the promise I'd made all those years ago, to never love a rich man, to never give anyone that kind of power over me again, was unraveling with every heartbeat. 9 months into our marriage of convenience, and I was living a contradiction. On paper, nothing had changed. We still had separate bedrooms. We still maintained the appearance of a business arrangement. But in reality, everything had shifted. The walls I'd built were crumbling faster than I could repair them. I found myself lingering in rooms just to be near him, making his favorite meals when he'd had a hard day, feeling a flutter in my stomach when he looked at me across the dinner table. It was terrifying. I'd spent so many years guarding my heart, and now it was betraying me completely. One night, I went back to my old apartment. I hadn't been there in weeks. The air was stale, dust covering surfaces that once held my entire life. I sat on my worn couch and tried to reconnect with the Emma who had made that promise all those years ago. The Emma who knew better than to trust a wealthy man. The Emma who wouldn't risk everything on feelings that might not be returned. My phone lit up with a text from James. Meeting ran late. Don't wait up for dinner. Nothing romantic or suggestive, just the kind of message spouses send every day. Yet I stared at it, feeling the weight of how much I'd come to depend on those small connections. I'd become everything I swore I'd never be, vulnerable, attached, in love with a man who might see me as nothing more than a convenient solution to a business problem. The next morning, I went to the office early, desperate to focus on work instead of the chaos in my heart. I buried myself in reports, barely acknowledging James when he arrived. If he noticed my distance, he didn't mention it. We moved through the day like actors following a script, professional and polite. Then James's sister Elise appeared in my office doorway. "Walk with me," she said, not really a request. In the elevator, she was unusually quiet until we reached the small garden terrace on the building's mid-level. "My brother is miserable," she finally said, turning to face me. "And I think you are too." I opened my mouth to deny it, but she cut me off. "Don't. I know about the arrangement. I've always known. What I don't think either of you planned on was falling in love for real." The word made me flinch. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" She raised an eyebrow. "Emma, I've known my brother all his life. I've seen him with women who wanted his money, his name, his connections. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." My heart stuttered. "He hasn't said anything." "Of course not," she sighed. "He's terrified. Your contract explicitly states this is a business arrangement. He thinks if he admits how he feels, you'll either laugh in his face or run for the hills." She touched my arm gently. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I didn't have an answer then. But later that day, when news broke that one of our major overseas factories was facing a political crisis, threatening to shut it down, I found myself stepping into action beside James without hesitation. For 3 days straight, we worked around the clock, strategizing, making calls, finding solutions no one else had considered. "We make a good team," he said on the third night as we finally resolved the situation, saving hundreds of jobs and millions in company assets. We were alone in the conference room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and takeout containers, exhausted but triumphant. "We do," I admitted. And it was true. Professionally, personally, we balanced each other in ways I'd never experienced with anyone else. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as nervousness. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "The year mark is coming up. According to our agreement, we need to decide whether to continue this arrangement or..." He hesitated. Dissolve it. I'd been so caught up in my feelings that I'd almost forgotten the timeline we'd agreed to. Oh, right. He stood up, moving to the window, his back to me. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And my voice came out smaller than I intended, and I don't want to end it. He turned, his expression more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. But not because of the company or my great uncle or any of the reasons we started this. I want to stay married to you because... He took a deep breath. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being pretend for me. I fell in love with you, Emma. Really in love. The world seemed to stop. Those were the words I'd been both longing for and dreading, because they forced me to face my own truth. You don't have to say anything, he continued quickly. I know this wasn't part of our deal. I know you made it clear from the beginning that you didn't want this to be real. If you want to end it, I'll honor our agreement. You'll still get everything we outlined in the contract, but I couldn't let the year end without telling you the truth. I stood frozen, my promise to 13-year-old me battling with the woman I'd become. The memories of my father's betrayal warred with the reality of James's steady presence. Fear fought against hope. Say something, he whispered. Please. I made a promise, I finally managed, my voice shaking. When my father left us for a younger woman, when he chose money and status over family, I swore I'd never give my heart to someone like him. Someone with wealth and power who could destroy me if I let them. I took a step toward him. I've spent months trying to keep that promise. His face fell, shoulders sagging with disappointment he couldn't hide. But I failed completely, I continued, taking another step. Because the truth is, you're nothing like him. You never were. I was so busy looking for similarities that I missed all the ways you're different. Hope flickered in his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that I love you too. Not your money or your name or your company, just you, the man who makes me tea when I'm tired, who flew in specialists for my mother without being asked, who values my opinion in the boardroom and listens to me at home. The distance between us vanished as he pulled me into his arms, holding me like he was afraid I might disappear. When he kissed me, it wasn't our first. We'd shared brief, public kisses for appearance's sake, but it was the first one that was completely real. No audience, no pretense, just us. Later that night, as we lay talking in what had always been his room, but would now be ours, I told him about my fears, about the little girl who'd watched her father walk away and vowed never to be that vulnerable again. I can't promise we'll never face challenges, he said, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin, but I can promise I'll never stop choosing you. Every day, in every decision. You're not a convenience or a business transaction to me. Emma, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. 2 weeks later, we stood on the balcony of a small beach house, exchanging vows again. No guests this time, no contracts or legal requirements, just two people choosing each other for real. As the sun set over the ocean, I realized that the promise I'd made all those years ago had been based on fear and pain. This new promise, to love and trust this man who had earned it completely, was based on hope and truth. Sometimes the promises we need to break are the ones we make to ourselves when we're too young to understand that not all wealth corrupts, not all power destroys, and not all hearts are the same. Sometimes the greatest risk isn't in loving, but in refusing to love at all. If 13-year-old me could see me now, she might not understand. But the woman I've become finally does. And that woman is happier than she ever thought possible. Married to a millionaire she swore she'd never love, but who turned out to be the only man worth breaking that promise for. It's been 2 years since I broke the promise I made to myself as a heartbroken teenager. 2 years of learning that people aren't defined by their bank accounts or their last names, but by the choices they make every day. 2 years of building a life I never imagined possible. I look back at the woman I was, so certain that all wealthy men were like my father, so determined to protect myself from pain that I almost missed out on the greatest happiness of my life. I was right to be cautious. I was right to value independence. But I was wrong to let one man's betrayal define how I saw an entire group of people. James isn't perfect. Neither am I. We still argue about board decisions and household chores. He still works too late sometimes, and I still struggle to fully believe that this happiness isn't temporary. But we face those challenges together, as true partners in every sense of the word. My mother lives with us now, in the guest house by the pool. Her health has improved dramatically with the treatments James helped secure. She tells me at least once a week how she always knew he was the one, even when I was stubbornly insisting our marriage was just business. Mothers have a way of seeing through our carefully constructed walls. James's family has mostly come around. His great-uncle still watches me with suspicion at family gatherings, convinced I must be after the Calloway fortune. But even he has softened after seeing us together these past 2 years. It's hard to doubt the authenticity of something when it's right in front of you. As for James's company, it's thriving. We make decisions together now. Officially, not just behind the scenes. I've learned more about business than I ever thought possible, and he's learned from me too. My perspective as someone who grew up without privilege has helped reshape some of the company's policies in ways that benefit all our employees. Last month, we launched a foundation to help single parents access education and childcare. It's my project mainly, born from watching my own mother struggle. When we cut the ribbon on the first sent her, I thought about how my teenage self would react to seeing me now, standing beside a millionaire, wearing clothes that cost more than our monthly rent used to be, my hand comfortably in his. She might be horrified at first, but I think if she could see the whole picture, the respect between us, the way he values my voice, the way we build each other up instead of tearing down, she might understand. I didn't betray that angry, hurt girl by falling in love with James. I healed her. People often ask me what the secret is. How did a marriage that started as a business arrangement turn into something real? The truth is both simple and complicated. We saw each other, really saw each other, beneath the labels and assumptions, beyond wealthy and working class, beyond boss and employee, beyond the roles we thought we had to play. I no longer believe that money is inherently corrupting or that wealth automatically makes someone untrustworthy. I've learned that character isn't determined by a bank balance but by daily choices and consistent actions. My father chose selfishness. James chooses us every day. That's not to say I've forgotten where I came from. I still count pennies sometimes, out of habit. I still volunteer at the community center where my mom used to take me after school. I still have my old apartment key on my keychain as a reminder of the strength I found there. But I've learned that independence doesn't have to mean isolation, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that sometimes breaking a promise to yourself is the bravest thing you can do. So if you're holding on to a promise you made when you were hurt or afraid, a promise that's keeping you from taking chances or opening your heart, maybe it's time to ask yourself if that promise is still serving you, or if, maybe, it's keeping you from the very happiness you deserve. As for me, I'm grateful every day that I found the courage to break mine. Because the girl who swore she'd never love a millionaire is now the woman who can't imagine life without one particular millionaire by her side, not because of his money, but because of his heart. And that has made all the difference. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of my journey. Drop a comment sharing what you'd do if you were in my shoes. Remember, sometimes the promises we need to break are the ones we make to ourselves. See you in the next video.